moving on to the water cycle, this might be a little bit more kind of like in your range of knowledge. You've probably learned about the water cycle quite a few times at this point. So we're just going to start at the top where this cloud is, and the very top thing is called condensation, right? Clouds, when they form up water, that's called condensation. And we're going to put this like pink definition there too. Water vapor that condenses into droplets that form clouds, that is the definition of condensation. And then what comes off of that is called precipitation, right? Rain, snow, any form of droplets that come out of the cloud, that's called precipitation. And when precipitation hits the ground, that's called runoff. Okay, so any water that's on top of the ground is called runoff. And then any water that goes into the actual ground, so like right below that, it's like kind of near actually this arrow, right? So when the precipitation hits like a mountain or something, that's called runoff, and that would be water on top of the ground. But when it hits the actual like grass and goes into the ground, that's called groundwater. So two different things, but very similar. So start with your cloud of condensation, which turns into precipitation as it falls. When it hits the mountains or I don't know, whatever, it's runoff, and as it soaks into the ground, that's called groundwater. Now, runoff can run into the ground, or it can run over here into like a lake or a river or an ocean. And when it goes into a lake or a river or an ocean, then it can go through what's called evaporation. And evaporation is when liquid becomes water vapor. And what happens is it starts to evaporate or become water vapor, and it will rise up into the sky. And eventually it will condense. And when it condenses, it will go back into this form of a cloud, and it will go through that cycle again. Alternatively, once the water's in the ground, it can also head on up over to trees, because trees take up water through the roots. And when that happens, a process called transpiration happens. And basically what transpiration is the literal definition of trees releasing water into the air. So again, if we start at the top, condensation is when clouds are formed, then it goes through precipitation, and it can go from here only really to one way, which is runoff, when that water hits the ground and it's on top of the ground at that point. But from there, it can go multiple ways. It can go into a lake where it can evaporate and go back into clouds, and that's kind of like a small little cycle. Or it can go into the ground and eventually be taken up by a tree or a bush or grass or any type of producer and go through a process called transpiration, where the producers will release that water back into the air, and it will do the same thing. It will evaporate back into the air and eventually condense into a cloud, but it just goes through trees versus straight off of a lake.